23, 2 Kings chapter 23. We are looking at the end of King Josiah's reign, which is the last positive point of Israel at this juncture while they're in the homeland. And so let's just back up for just a second and see. You remember he's led restoration. He's done a number of different things. But let's back up to and begin reading in verse 21 and work our way down. It says, "And the king commanded all the people, keep the Passover of the Lord your God, as it is written in the book of the covenant. For no such Passover has been kept since the days of the judges who judged Israel, or during all the days of the kings of Israel or the kings of Judah. But in the 18th year of King Josiah, the Passover was kept to the Lord in Jerusalem. Moreover, Josiah put away the mediums and the necromancers and the household gods and the idols and the abominations that were seen in the land of Judah and Jerusalem, that he might establish the words of the law that were written in the book that Hilkiah the priest found in the house of the Lord. Before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might, according to the law of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him." And so that's kind of the close of his work. But you remember, I think the last thing we said, and that was several weeks ago now, is if you'll notice in 25, he turned to the Lord with all of his heart, with all of his soul, and with all of his might. And when you look at Deuteronomy 6, 4, and 5, the beloved Shema of the Jewish nation, that Jesus quotes when he is asked what is the greatest command in the law, and he said, "You love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your might." And that's the way of this being mentioned here is the narrator of the Kings telling us there was no king that ever did it like him. No king that ever turned to God with every single thing that he had. Every fiber of his being belonged to God. And remember, he was facing no external pressure. Nobody was putting any pressure on him to do it. He simply chose to do it. And he had already been told that no matter how hard he tried, it wasn't really going to change God's mind. God had already decided in chapter 21, because of the reign of Manasseh, that nothing was going to change. I mean, Israel was doomed at that point forward. And so he did it for the glory of God's name. And it reminds me of the song, I can't remember the title of the song, but when you move into the chorus, it says, "Let the glory of your name be the passion of the church." Let the glory of your name be the passion of your church. That's what drives us, is to see God glorified in everything. And I think Josiah is an example of that. Even though he wouldn't get the results he wanted in the long term, it was about God being glorified as long as he had breath in him. And he did everything that he could. And for that, we have his story in front of us as a very positive example. But then we come to 26, which is where we left off, and he reiterates this point. "Still the Lord did not turn away from the burning of his great wrath, by which his anger was kindled against Judah because of all the provocations with which Manasseh had provoked him. And the Lord said, I will remove Judah also out of my sight, as I have removed Israel, and I will cast off this city that I have chosen, Jerusalem, and the house which I said, my name shall be there." And so God is, there was never a king any better than Josiah, and even then it wasn't good enough. They had already gone too far. It reminds you of later on, which is what we'll get into in 24, during that time period, the prophet Ezekiel, God says through Ezekiel in Ezekiel 14, 12 through 20, that if Noah and Job and Daniel were in the city, they could only save themselves by their righteousness. Even those three great men of faith couldn't influence anybody else. That's how sinful the nation had become. It permeated them. And so even though he was a tremendous king, it's not enough to turn things around. And then in verse 28 it says, "Now the rest of the acts of Josiah and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? In his days Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates, And King Josiah went to meet him, and Pharaoh Necho killed him at Megiddo as soon as he saw him. And his servants carried him dead in a chariot from Megiddo and brought him to Jerusalem and buried him in his own tomb. And the people of the land took Jehoahaz, the son of Josiah, and anointed him and made him king in his father's place. Now, before we kind of think on that a little bit more, I want to read 2 Chronicles 35, verse 20, because it gives us a little bit fuller picture. It says, after all this, when Josiah had repaired the temple, Necho, the king of Egypt, went up to fight at Carchemish on the Euphrates, and Josiah went out to meet him. But Josiah sent envoys to him, saying, what have we to do with each other, king of Judah? I am not coming against you this day, but against the house with which I am at war. And God has commanded me to hurry. Cease opposing God who is with me, lest he destroy you. Nevertheless, Josiah did not turn away from him, but disguised himself in order to fight with him. He did not listen to the words of Necho from the mouth of God, but came to fight in the plain of Megiddo. And the archers shot King Josiah, and the king said to his servants, take me away, for I am badly wounded. So his servants took him out of the chariot and carried him in the second chariot and brought him to Jerusalem, and he died and was buried in the tombs of his fathers. All Judah and Jerusalem mourned for Josiah. Jeremiah also uttered a lament for Josiah, and all the singing men and singing women have spoken of Josiah in their laments to this day. They made these a rule in Israel. Behold, they are written in the laments. Now the rest of the acts of Josiah and his good deeds, according to what is written in the law of the Lord, and his acts, first and last, behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. So what is going on here is that, so Necho, the king of Egypt, is going to meet up with the king of Assyria. The king of Assyria is holding on by a thread. And so he has allied himself with Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt. And they're going to meet one another to then meet, well, at that time, Nabopolassar was the king of Babylon, the father of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was his general. So they're going to meet him at war, and Josiah inserts himself into this. Now, it's kind of hard to tell why he does that. Matter of fact, we're not really told at all. God even, this is one of those rare moments where God speaks through an unbeliever to a believer about the fact that he doesn't need to go. That is one of the things that when you study inspiration and you take in all the facts about inspiration, one of the things about inspiration is that on the whole, most of the times inspiration comes through people who are believers, but not always. Okay? God can use any person to communicate his message. As a matter of fact, he used a donkey one time to communicate. Right? So you've got Balaam's donkey, so he can use that. And so on this occasion, it seems as if it says here, he's speaking through Pharaoh Necho, telling him that he doesn't need to get involved in this. He doesn't have a dog in this fight, and he didn't. But he continues to go anyway, and he's killed in the plain of Megiddo. Now, I think we have talked about Megiddo before, but it was a common place in northern Israel where war took place, because you had the setting was right. You could divide your armies up off to the sides, had natural barriers, but it also had an open plain where the armies could come and meet in war. Now, the reason why this is going to be more important is when we get into Revelation, we're going to run into this battle of Armageddon. And what in the world is all of this? Well, in the words of Shakespeare, it's much ado about nothing, to be honest with you. It's not what people have turned it into. And we're going to see that a lot in Revelation. Once you get there, you're going to wonder why there's so much discussion about some of these things and why there's so much controversy. Because the book itself doesn't emphasize these things. There is a battle of Armageddon, but it's not a literal battle. It's never really been about that. It's built on this image of this place, this plain called Megiddo, where a lot of battles took place. That's all it is. And so he's a New Testament writer picking up on an Old Testament image to communicate a truth, which is as common as Matthew 1:1 to the end of Revelation 22. And so he ends up being killed here at Megiddo and is taken back to his home and buried, and Jeremiah, who began preaching early on during the reign of Josiah. He mourns for him and laments for him. We do not have that actual lamentation that he wrote, although we do have the book of Lamentations, but that's for the city that will take place 20 years later. So Josiah is gone, and so he's at a very young age. He's not even 40, if I remember correctly, at this point. 8 years old, reigns 31 years. So, yeah, he lives to be 39. And, I think about, for me, when I hit certain ages, I think about certain things. Like, when I was 33, the whole year was just kind of surreal to me. I'm thinking, oh, Jesus had already changed the whole world by 33. This is something. I think about that span from 30 to 33. But then you look at somebody like Josiah and you see all that he was able to do, and he was just 39. I'm 36. It's pretty amazing. And for him to be remembered the way that he is, for his passion for God, his love for God, he's one of my favorites. But now he has exited the stage, and that is to Judah's detriment. Because now the people take Jehoiahaz, his son, and anoint him and make him king in his father's place. Josiah actually has another son, Johanan. He's the oldest son, but he's not really mentioned anywhere, so the most likely theory, the most likely guess is that he's probably dead at this point. That's why he's not. Very similar to what happened when we opened Kings in 1 Kings 1 and 2 with Solomon. So here he is. Now, in 31, we're told some things about him. So we're going to see a pattern develop here. So we're going to see a king reign for 3 months, and then another king for 11 years, and then another king for 3 months, and then another king for 11 years, and that's it. Judah is done at that point. Okay? So Jehoiahaz is the first. He was 23 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his fathers had done. And Pharaoh Necho put him in bonds at Riblah, which is located on the Orontes River. It is situated a little bit later. Jehoiakim is going to be captured and taken to the king of Babylon at Riblah as well. It was located perfectly on 2 major military highways. And it was also used kind of as an area for planning. Those of you with a military background will probably understand that better than I do. It was apparently a good place where you could send out information, but also a safe enough place. This is kind of where when you were making invasions, you kind of stopped here, and this kind of became your command center for operations in that region. And so he's taken to Riblah, and in the land of Hamath, that he might not reign in Jerusalem. And he laid on the land a tribute of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. Okay? So Jehoiahaz is dethroned after only 3 months. Now, most likely, he is dethroned because of his anti-Egyptian policy. You remember, when you back up a little bit, the kings they had anti-Assyrian policies, anti-Babylonian policies. Should we be friends with these nations? That's the kind of the way kings were. We had a lot of executions based upon that. Some people liked the decision, some people didn't. And so it seems like Jehoiahaz was, like his father, an anti-Assyrian leader. He didn't want to, or an anti-Egyptian leader. He did not want to ally himself with Egypt. And so for that reason, you can see why then Pharaoh Necho would take him off the throne. I'll just put another guy that agrees with the world the way I see it and put him on the throne, and we'll just move that way. And so that's what he does. And then he taxes the land with 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. A talent, as we've talked about before, when it comes to measurements of money, we're not dealing with coins, we're dealing with weight. okay? A talent is a weight. It's a measurement. So you get your scale, and a talent is roughly 75 pounds or so. It's also equivalent to about 20 years worth of wages. And so you can kind of calculate those things however you choose to. I mean, if you took the average American wage was, say, $50,000 and 20 years of that, so you're talking, what, $1 million bucks. It's a pretty significant amount of money. And so he puts on him 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. And Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim, the son of Josiah, king in the place of Josiah his father, and changed his name to Jehoiakim. Now, this is one of the things we're going to see. We're going to see this a lot in these last chapters. The name is going to be changed, and we're also going to see it when we move into the opening chapter of Daniel. The name is going to be changed of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They're going to be changed to Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, the reason why that is significant, the changing of the name, so in ancient Near Eastern culture, choosing a name symbolized authority, okay? So for an example, when you get to Genesis 2 and verse 19, and God calls the animals in front of Adam and says, and sees what he will call them, what he will name them. That's an illustration of the truth that he had pronounced in chapter 1 when he said, you will have dominion over the earth. You'll control it. You'll rule it. His naming of the animals is one indication of that dominion. To name an individual indicates sovereignty or control over the individual. And so when Necho here changes the name of Eliakim to Jehoiakim, he's now saying, you work for me. I control you. I own you. And that's what's going to happen when we see a lot of other name changes, and that's exactly what we have to keep in mind when we get to Daniel, and he starts changing their names. It's a way of completely changing their understanding, and he's trying to communicate them changing their allegiances, but Daniel and his friends are going to show that you can change our name, but you won't change our allegiance. And that's what you see in the opening chapters of the book. And so it's already starting here. And so Jehoiakim in verse 35 gave the silver and the gold to Pharaoh, and he taxed the land to give the money according to the command of Pharaoh. He exacted the silver and the gold of the people of the land from everyone according to his assessment to give it to Pharaoh Necho. So Pharaoh Necho says, you've got to pay us. Well, instead of dipping into his own pocket, where do most people normally dip when you're in power? Dip into everybody else's pocket. So he started taxing them. And that's how he's going to pay the tax. I mean, he's not going to pay it himself. Now, one of the things that is interesting is in previous chapters, like in, say, chapter 15 or chapter 18 or some of the other places, when these kings start putting tribute on the nation of Israel or the nation of Judah, where did the kings usually find the money to pay for it? It was like this multi-billion-dollar facility in its beginning. Temple. They raid the temple. They pull the money out of there. They pull the gold off the doors. So what does it tell you if he's not raiding the temple? It's starting to get depleted. Now, they're still going to raid it, certainly. We're going to see that in 24 and 25. But it's starting to get depleted. They're running out of options now, which shows you that, they can't pay their debts. So they're going to be in serious trouble, and they're headed for ruin very quickly. All right? Now, Jehoiakim is an interesting guy. He is also known as Shallum, Shallum. And he has a lot of interaction. So to kind of put this in perspective, he has a lot of interaction with Jeremiah. So to put this in perspective, Jeremiah is 52 chapters, okay? Those 52 chapters of Jeremiah fit between 2 Kings 22 and 25. 2 Kings 22 and 25 are all 52 chapters of Jeremiah. Okay? Jeremiah's ministry begins during the reign of Josiah, and when you watch the date stamps throughout the rest of Jeremiah, he's interacting with Jehoiakim or with Zedekiah or with Jehoiakim or some of the others. So all of that book, if we wanted to, don't worry, I'm not going to do it, we could stop, go to Jeremiah, and start. And we would see how everything begins to intersect. Okay? Now, Jehoiakim, we're told of him a little more beginning in 36. It says, and he was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zebediah, the daughter of Pedaiah of Rumah. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord according to all that his fathers had done. Okay? Now, very quickly, here are a couple things he did. Number one, in Jeremiah 36, he's the one who, Jeremiah was writing his prophecy, and the prophecy was being read to the king as he was warming himself by the fire. And so he would read a few lines of the scroll, and then he would literally take his knife, and he would cut it out, and he would throw it into the fire. Okay? People say, that's bold. You're going to take a knife to the Word of God? Listen, I get it. Like, I would feel strange about doing that too. But I mean, tell me really, what is the difference between somebody taking a penknife and cutting it and burning it, and somebody taking it and going, I don't care what it says, I ain't doing it? I mean, what ultimately is the difference? None. How you disregard it is different. Others, you disregard it literally by putting it in a fire, out of sight, out of mind, and others, you just ignore it and let it stay in its printed form. And so he does that. Also, look at, for just a second, Jeremiah 22, beginning in verse 11, and let's see. Jeremiah has some things to say about him. He says, for thus says the Lord concerning Shallum, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, who reigned instead of Josiah his father, and who went away from his place, he shall return here no more. But in the place where they have carried him captive, there he shall die, and he shall never see this land again. Woe to him who builds his house by unrighteousness, and his upper rooms by injustice, who makes his neighbor serve him for nothing, and does not give him his wages. So one of the first things that he's doing in his reign is he is exploiting his workers. Right? He's exploiting the people who work for him. By the way, you'd be shocked at the amount of times God speaks about this subject in the Bible, about employers who exploit their employees. Verse 14, who says, I will build myself a great house with spacious upper rooms, who cut out windows for it, paneling it with cedar and painting it with vermilion. Do you think that you are a king because you compete in cedar? Did not your father eat and drink and do justice and righteousness? Then it was all well with him. What he's saying is this. If you want to be a king, you don't have to mistreat people to be a king. Your father, Josiah, honored people, treated people with dignity and respect, and he was a king, and he was a wealthy king. And things went well for him. You can still take care of the people who work for you and reap benefits. The two are not mutually exclusive. And so he says, verse 16, speaking of Josiah, he judged the cause of the poor and the needy, then it was well. Josiah, as so much of the Old Testament prophets speak about, the plight of the poor and the way that they are treated. He says, Josiah, your father, he judged the cause of the poor and the needy. He did not let people mistreat them. But you have eyes and heart only for dishonest gain, for shedding innocent blood and practicing oppression and violence. Those are some of the sins of Jehoiakim. And because of that, we're going to begin the first phase of captivity. And I know he got up to ring the bell, so we're not going to start the first phase of captivity. If you remember I'll just give you some things to kind of mark and see in the text itself. So you remember they go into captivity in 3 different levels. In 606 BC, they take the royal family away, which is where you've got Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So we can stop here and we can insert at least the opening chapter of Daniel here, and perhaps maybe the first 3 chapters somewhere here in chapters 24 and 25. Now the stuff later, no, that's completely different. So in chapter 24, I've got 606 BC jotted down because I know this is the first captivity. When you come to verse 10 of this chapter, in chapter 24, this is now 597 BC. This is that second trip that they take in captivity, where he takes the warriors, the skilled workers, Ezekiel, those people. And then in chapter 25 and verse 1 through the end of that chapter, or through really the end of verse 21, that's 586. That's the last tier. That's when everybody but the poorest people of the land are left to be able to grow some crops to pay the king back. But that's kind of the breakdown. 24:1 begins 606. 24:10 is 597, and 25:1 through 21 is 586. And so we'll work our way through this, hopefully in the next few weeks.